Hello again. My name is Liam, and you're on Office Hours with the Mad Professor. Today I want to make a few comments on transgenderism. This comes because I had a friend recommend a short video to me, Ben Shapiro Destroys Transgender, etc., from a Q&A that he gave at some university. And I'm going to cut in 3 short clips from it and then respond to 3 different areas that he brings up. Because this is a topic that I could, blather on about for a long time. It's something that I teach. Well, not transgender itself, but the history of human sexuality. And so to constrain this, to limit the coverage, we're going to respond to 3 specific arguments that he makes, or 3 different areas in which he makes an argument. Semantical argument, biological argument, and historical argument. And I'm going to, in each one of them, present some counter evidence to what he's trying to say in this. All right, so here's the first little clip I want to use. It refers to what I'll discuss as a semantical argument. Here's Ben.
So, how do you say that some people don't have privilege when you basically just said that trans people aren't valid? They're not a thing. They're just girls pretending to be boys or boys pretending to be girls.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, someone's excited. Okay.
That's biological, but gender is a completely different thing.
No, gender is not disconnected from sex. So.
It's not completely disconnected, but it's still a cultural thing. It's still from society. It's
okay. No, it is not in the mind. Okay, you're not a man if you think you're a man.
Now, he argues here that gender is not disconnected from sex. And he's making an argument that I've seen very commonly in discussions, both in person and online, that gender and sex are somehow the same thing. And this comes out of the way they're commonly used. So the best response to this is to address the meanings of the word. Because when people discuss gender in the context of transgender people, they're using the definition of the word as it is understood in academia, in science, realistically, for anybody who uses a dictionary or makes use of an encyclopedia set and really knows the word. If they're just used to checking off a box, male, female, when something says gender on a rental application or something, then they're not really using the word in the same way. They're conflating it in their head with biological sex. Gender has never meant biological sex. It literally means the social expression of sexual characteristics, which means the social expression of certain norms associated with one sex or the other by that society, which means, of course, those norms vary from place to place. Some of them have an ultimate foundation in biology, but most of them actually come about historically, culturally. They're contingent. They develop for specific reasons in specific places. My cat is trying to get into the video. So the argument he makes is a little bit more nuanced than many that I've seen online, with people saying, oh, gender is sex, they're the same thing. He's clearly not saying that. He is saying gender is not disconnected from sex, and that makes a certain amount of sense. People's gender identities frequently conform to their biological sex. Well, that, of course, is the whole point of terms like gender non-conforming. Some people's do not, which is what we're going to have to address in the biological discussion that follows this. But we do need to understand that the two are distinct, that gender and sex are not the same thing and never have been the same thing. Gender is a term developed specifically to apply to the study of cultures. It's a term out of anthropology and sociology, originally adapted from a simple grammatical term. It originally only meant, grammatical case, masculine, feminine, and neuter. And if you think about that, that is why the anthropologists were able to use this word. That's why it was chosen. Because what they're after in talking about gender isn't sex. Somebody is not the male gender, they are masculine, right? It's talking about specific traits and norms, specific behaviors, specific things seen as masculine within a particular society. You see what we're saying here? That it's not about male and female when you're talking about gender. Gender is specifically masculine, feminine, or, to use the grammatical case, neuter. So you already have a kind of built-in ambiguity in it, which was intentional in adopting and adapting this word to discuss the phenomenon. Because, as we'll see in the last part that I discuss here, the historical, there has always been tremendous variation in expression from culture to culture and place to place. People who do not fit into the standard male, female, masculine, feminine binary. All right, we'll come back to that. So, the next piece I'll play for you from Ben. Here we go.
Okay, I said a boy who thinks he's a girl. That's the usual phraseology I use. Not playing. I usually say a boy who thinks he's a girl or a girl who thinks he's a boy, which is technically what we're talking about here. As far as the actual psychological issues at play, it used to be called gender dysphoria or gender identity disorder. Now they call it gender dysphoria. The idea that sex or gender are malleable is not true. Okay, and I'm not denying your humanity if you're a transgender person. I am saying that you are not the sex to which you claim to be. You're still a human being, and you're a human being with an issue that I wish you Godspeed in dealing with in whatever way you see fit. But if you are going to dictate to me that I'm supposed to pretend that men are women and women are men, no. My answer is no. I'm not going to modify basic biology because it threatens your subjective sense of what you are.
All right, so in this one, he lays out the way he likes to refer to the basic question of transgenderism, a boy who thinks he's a girl, etc., and he refuses to adopt the different pronouns appropriate to the person's actual identity, and will call like a transgender person by the one that he thinks associates with their biological sex, because he thinks that it's a psychological issue. And he wishes people luck in getting treatment for whatever he thinks is wrong with them. So let's think about what is wrong with them, because that's the whole foundation of his argument here. He tries to make the point that sex and gender are not malleable, that they're somehow fixed. And for him, that means fixed in the entire biology, referring to, well, from anyway, the genitalia. Having a penis makes you a boy, it makes you male, and that is the end of the story for him. Well, in one way, he's right. It's not malleable because it's distinctly neurological and hormonal. Your sex identity and your gender identity, again, two different things, and I would be remiss if I didn't note that there are other ways in which this sort of issue comes up. Your gender expression is not connected to, for example, sexual orientation. Sexual orientation and gender are two different things. You can see this, for example, in the issues of like transvestism. Most people who dress up as the opposite sex actually are, what heteronormative in other ways, in terms of sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is a different thing, but it is also neurological. There are distinct physical brain differences, for example, in the size of the hypothalamus and whatnot, that identify people who are more inclined toward, a homosexual orientation. This is something that's deeply wired into people. It's not a choice, but set that aside. You can also set aside the mosaicism, the people who have multiple sets of chromosomes, or their chromosome expression changes or shifts from cell to cell. The order of them changes, the number changes. That affects a relatively small part of the population, but they do exist, so we should acknowledge, yes, technically there are more than two sexes if you bring them into the case. There's also the case of intersex people who are born with the genitalia of both sexes. And this can happen to varying degrees, and it becomes a real problem, especially when people make decisions to have surgery done to choose one sex or the other before the brain is developed enough to really be able to see the difference in which brain it is. Because male and female brains are different. There are some fundamental structural differences. Not ones that can bring in a sort of value judgment, better than the other or smarter or whatever here, but differences in the way that they process information, differences in basic structure and function. Male and female brains are different. Let's set that aside. So an intersex person may have, for example, a brain that is closer to male, but if they made the decision to remove the male genitalia and assign the female sex, that can cause all kinds of problems for people. So it is really best for intersex to kind of let it take its course and let them choose. But again, let's set aside the question of intersex. So I'm going to set all these other ones aside and focus specifically on the question of gender and gender identity. Where does that come from? People often make the argument that it's purely chosen, that it's something out of the social structures here, going back to the definition of gender, that it reflects social norms. But honestly, the basic reason for gender nonconformity is also neurological. There are physical differences that have been identified in the brains of people with transgenderism, people who feel that they are and have always felt that they are the other gender or the other sex. So, example of that. So, in male to female transgender peoples, they've actually been able to recognize that prior to treatments, because treatments will exacerbate these things, the hormones do affect the structure of the brain, that they find thinner cortical regions in the right hemisphere of the brain, which actually matches more the structure of a female brain. So here is someone who is biologically born male genitalia, and yet some of their brain structure actually reflects the opposite sex. Now, there are things that have been found for both kinds of transgenderism, both sexes originally here. And what you can see out of this is that it's not a simple question of people being born in the wrong body, that they have the wrong brain to match the rest of their anatomy. It's not really that simple. It's more a matter of there is a common male brain and a common female brain, and then there are transgender brains. There are distinct differences in them that put them apart from both. Right? Now, someone might be tempted to say, well, it's brain damage or something. There's, again, medical treatment, blah, 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 and that might be the route that someone like a Ben Shapiro would take. I don't think that makes a lot of sense, because this is a naturally occurring development. This is something that has always been present with us. There have always been people who do not express the same kinds of gender identity, and clearly natural selection has not eliminated this as somehow a threat to the species. Right? It's not been a problem. It's simply been something that different societies had to find ways to deal with, to understand, to give appropriate labels and recognition to them. But they've always been with us. So when Shapiro says, for example, that it's really a question of like basic biology, well, he's actually right, but wrong at the same time. He's right in the expression that it is a matter of biology. He just doesn't understand the biology. He takes basically a kindergarten view of biology. Boys have a penis, girls have vagina, end of subject. And that's not really how it works. Your biology is the entirety of your anatomy and physiology. That includes your brain and your basic hormonal structure. If the brain does not match your biological sex in the same way, that if it does show significant variations from that sex that happen to reflect the opposite sex that the person just by coincidence happens to feel better matches what they want, what they kind of feel they should be, well, by God, that then shows that transgenderism is biological. It's natural, that it is an actual thing, and therefore cannot be denied. So that answers the biological part. All right, so I'm going to play the last short clip from Shapiro's talk, and we'll respond to that.
I'm saying that the Boy Scouts have a standard. You must be a biological boy to be a Boy Scout. You have to be a boy to be a Boy Scout.
Where's that written, though?
in the name Boy Scouts. Because this is a very because for all of human history, boy meant boy and girl meant girl. Boy did not mean girl.
People are breaking more things like culture.
And if I call you a moose, are you suddenly a moose? Okay, if I redefine our terms. No, yes, that's right. Men and women are a completely different thing. This is true. Have you ever met a man or a woman?
All right, in this clip, we see Mr. Shapiro making the entirely specious claim that for all of human history, boy meant boy and girl meant girl. I love this sort of hyperbolic expressions, and don't get me wrong, I'm plenty guilty of hyperbole. But they really don't have any place in this kind of discussion, especially when they are so thoroughly wrong-headed. Right? This is something that, again, I could ramble on forever about, but let's think just a few examples here of varying gender expressions throughout human history, for all of human history. Okay, so how about let's start here in America. How about a significant number of the Plains Amerindians, the Plains Native Americans tribes, not all of, but quite a few, had what we can call what's sometimes called the Two-Spirit people, or adapting an older term, the Berdache peoples, peoples who were understood to not fit into the common gender stereotypes. So here you had tribes dividing people based upon how the kids themselves express their sex. If you had a young boy who preferred to sit with the women and do the women's crafts instead of studying with the rest to go off and hunt or something, then that boy started to be understood here as one of the Two-Spirit peoples and was sort of accepted into that. If they grew up into the role, they could often then adopt female clothing and, study amongst the women there. But they weren't understood to be female. They were clearly biologically still understood to be males, like boys, but they were understood to fall into a different kind of category. You have the same thing with a number of females. Not every tribe, but many tribes also understood females who could do the same thing. There were women who went off as warriors, who did the hunting, who cut their hair short, adopted boys' clothes, and went off with the men to do things. They were not understood to be male in the biological sense, but they were clearly understood not to conform to the social expectations of a female for the tribe. They were gender non-conforming. So what did they do? They had a distinct label for it in their language, and they just went with it. Different tribes had different customs regarding this, but this is well documented. There are tons of discussions here all across the 19th century of people interacting with the tribes and seeing this. So let's leave America. How about within let's do a straight linear progression here from the Greeks to the Romans to the Arabs to Ottoman Turks, so all the way up to all the way up to the 19th century. You have in the Eastern Mediterranean an understanding of sexuality that is both unconstrained in the same sense in terms of linking sex and gender tightly together, and also decoupling sexual orientation. The idea of sexual orientation, the idea of being heterosexual or homosexual, those are modern concepts. They're actually very recent ideas. Heterosexuality has a very short history. For most cultures and for most of human history, people have not referred to themselves in most cultures by what they're attracted to, right? They've had other means to express themselves. They've had other forms of identity that took precedence. The sense of identifying yourself as, I am a heterosexual, that's a relatively recent idea. And I don't just mean in the word, I mean in the core concept. Think about the Greco-Roman concepts here, both Greek and Roman. There are differences between their sexualities. We don't need to get into them here. It's the core idea in both of them, and the Greeks will pass this to the Romans to the Arabs to the Turks. The basic breakdown is one of power. right? Not of what you're attracted to. It's a matter of dominance and submission. Sex is not something people do together. Sex is something one does to another. It's something you do to something. There's a sharp distinction between the active sexuality and the passive sexuality. Right? Someone has to be the penetrator, someone has to be the penetratee. So, of course, lesbian sex was not really considered sex by any of those four cultures. We can set that aside. It's a whole different topic. But males having sex with either females or males, it wasn't really the issue. Right? What you chose and what you were attracted to did not define you as a person. You didn't say, oh, that guy is gay because he likes to sleep with boys instead of girls. It wasn't really a term of identification. The core issue is, as long as he was the penetrator, he still had a masculine social role. He still had the masculine identity. If, on the other hand, he took the passive position in sexuality, in homosexual sexuality, he was then adopting a female role. And there you have the extremely sharply gendered understanding of sexuality in all these cultures. The Greek and Romans were extraordinarily misogynistic people. Female sexuality didn't really count. Women didn't count. They had no legal rights. So a male putting himself on the role of a female by submitting sexually lost status. Which is why generally it was socially acceptable as long as you were younger, as long as you were, say, before 20, before you've started to reach real sexual maturity as an adult, but wasn't really socially acceptable for older males to submit sexually, because to do so would be to surrender their masculine social role. So here again we can see that the biological sex and sex orientation are not really the key factors for them at all. It's simply a matter of the understanding of power. They sharply link power to gender, right? To gender understandings. Because clearly the people sort of falling in between, the young boys that were pursued here, the catamites, to use a technical term, or the eromenos, and the erastes, the pursuit here between adult males and boys there, it wasn't, they weren't really thinking in terms of whether somebody's gay, and the person wasn't really adopting a female role per se. They were clearly understood as fulfilling a different need, as performing a different function. We can see a much more clear expression of that in some ways if we move slightly east into the Persianate world, where you have the concept of the amrad, a youth who can be both either male or female, and who is an equally desired object of beauty to both. And young males staying into that kind of role, and keeping their face smooth, this kind of thing here, keeping the beard off, were understood in many ways as a third sex, as fulfilling the role of a third sex, as not being male or female biologically, as having a very distinct gender identity unique to the amrad social role. And you can see that also in South Asia, with a custom that's gone back literally for thousands of years. We can trace this back. So again, Shapiro's "for all of human history" is completely false. The hijra of South Asia are people who are born biologically of a particular sex into a society that has very rigid social roles that would force you to act in certain ways, and you have to do so in order to basically fulfill particular social duties. You perform the things that would sort of make up your dharma in order to both help yourself in this life and in the next incarnation. You absolutely, it's very tightly constrained identities. But what if you're gender non-conforming? And again, this is a biological phenomenon. This is a neurological phenomenon. If you are born gender non-conforming and don't fit into this, then they come up with a way to explain that, to understand that. People could leave their homes and join a hijra community. Not all, but many hijra actually chose to, if they were born male, undergo full castration and completely removed, penis, testicles, whatever here, and were understood to be a third sex. And that third sex, well, honestly, it is legally recognized even today in India. But set aside the idea here of a third sex for a second and just think of it in terms of the gender nonconformity. This is because somebody did not fit into a particular social role. It may have been because of an issue of sexual orientation. It may have been because of an issue of gender expression, because, again, they're not the same thing. But for one reason or another, people could not fit into the simple boy-girl binary that Shapiro sets up, right? That boy means boy and girl means girl. Well, these people clearly did not fit into that. So they chose a third route. They became hijra, right? And adopted a completely different identity that suited better their own internal drives. We can see these kind of phenomenon everywhere we look in the world. You can find them far down in sub-Saharan Africa. You can find them in Eastern Asia. You can find them in Europe. They're everywhere. We've never not had people who were gender non-conforming. And again, people can make the argument here that it's, oh, well, we've never not had people who are mentally ill. But again, that also is a modern concept. But even set aside that shift for a moment here and just think, is it really somehow wrong or different? Who does it harm, right? If you simply feel differently about your own life and your own expression of sexuality and what feels natural to you. Most societies have kind of come down on the side that this really isn't that big a deal. It's really not a huge threat, and have come up with some kind of explanation for it, some sort of understanding of it. The Jewish tradition is actually uncommon in not having a very distinct understanding of this, and in fact explicitly rejecting the Greco-Roman understanding of this. You've got some interesting writings there in the Hellenistic period of Jewish writers criticizing Greek sexual norms. But it's far from like the only one that did that, but we do want to understand that it is still uncommon for that. Most cultures have managed to find some way to explain or rationalize or justify or to provide some sort of basic role or outlet for people who do not fit in, who are gender non-conforming. Which again takes us all the way back, right? We'll conclude this video here by bringing us back to the biology. And note that, again, gender nonconformity is a biological issue. It's one that's always been with us. It's one that always will be with us because it is an evolved expression of human sexuality. It's a part of normal human neurodiversity. Some people are going to be born with brains that do not quite fit into a perfect boy is boy and girl is girl binary, and instead fall somewhere in between. And the science is very clear on this. And we can see this in sexual orientation. You can see this in gender. In tons of areas, the modern science, if you want to start looking up articles in elite journals like Nature, you will see discussions here of these things as being on a spectrum, on a line between them. Not a simple one or the other, black or white, but actually being, a giant gray area, a gradient between the two ends. All right, with people falling somewhere along the two of them, and some people falling, very considerably more toward the middle there. So, all right, there's my little discussion there of transgenderism, and I don't know if I would say that I have destroyed Ben Shapiro or something. I tend to dislike all these kind of titles and labels and whatnot here, but I'm responding is the point. I'm trying to respond to the perspectives that Mr. Shapiro raises, since I see them all the time, not just from him, and I think that this is a conversation that we as a society have to have so that we can decide how to deal with this and come up with our own understanding of that, and maybe some categories that we can actually more commonly accept. All right. All right. So this has been Office Hours with the Mad Professor. Again, I'm Liam. If you enjoy these little videos, there's a subscribe button down here, and I'll see you again next time.